Hopefully all this works. And hopefully you can see my screen now, but I can't see you. So somebody yell if you can't see it. Thank you for inviting me to be here this morning. I started working on this topic around Father's Day. So I was thinking about ancestors and descendants, grandparents and grandchildren. You know, at some point during the last few years, it seemed to Anne and me that grandchildren are probably not in our future. And for me, this brought a little bit of sadness. Now, I'm not a pronatalist. I've been very careful never to pressure or even really encourage our kids to have children of their own. It's just not my decision, and I want them to make it for themselves either way. But I see you grandparents. I know what I'll be missing, and I'm kind of sad. But I also know intellectually that what truly matters in this world is not my grandchildren anyway, but the grandchildren. Humanity is in a precarious place now, one where it is no longer possible to protect my grandchildren unless we repair the world for all the grandchildren. This is my mom with her two great-grandchildren. Only one of them is a genetic descendant of hers. Can you tell which? No, you cannot. And if for even a fraction of a second you thought you could, well, think about that. Our brains have habits, and those habits come from somewhere. And that's what I'm getting at this morning. This is my mom's father, my grandfather. He was a good man, and he was a product of his time. He believed deep in his bones that German people are the best. And he kept this detailed hierarchy of ethnicities and racial groups somewhere in his head. I don't actually know how long his ancestors were in North America, but I'm pretty certain they were German or mostly German. That's just part of my heritage. On the other side, my father's father was a genealogist, so I know that his ancestors were here a fairly long time. For example, I am directly related to the Admiral Dewey, who is known as, quote, the hero of Manila Bay for defeating the Spanish Armada during the Spanish-American War. And Grandpa was kind of unhappy that I changed my last name when Ann and I got married. So my American heritage from his side goes pretty far back on this continent. My American heritage. Well, every summer on July 4th, most Americans, including me, celebrate the victory of plucky pioneer forefathers over the well-regimented armies of an oppressive monarch, a victory which we celebrate by blowing stuff up. Well, I happen to really love fireworks, even knowing that they are a reenactment of exactly what's happening in Ukraine right now. Fireworks are a beautiful and inspiring way that we glorify what is inherently evil. I can't reconcile these myself. I still love fireworks. I shot this video that you're seeing of the grand finale in Carcassonne, France, on Bastille Day a few years ago from a mile away. So they really do fireworks on Bastille Day in France. My American heritage. Well, in 2008, I took a test of implicit bias, and I discovered that in spite of all my enlightened efforts at treating people the same, my subconscious mind holds a stubborn bias against people of color. Ever since then, I've been looking more critically at my own heritage, especially its origins. Where did white culture come from? How did we get here? Well, after reading this book, I have an answer, or at least a strong clue. I think the origins of my American heritage are rooted in trauma. We know that families that have endured trauma are more prone to addictions, to abuse, to neglect, and other kinds of family dysfunction. And such families often have an unspoken code of conduct that goes, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, and don't remember. Don't talk about the dysfunctions. Don't trust anyone because traumatized people are kind of unpredictable and sometimes violent. Don't feel your feelings because they don't matter and you'll be punished if you express them. and don't remember anything that would undermine the happy family facade, because everybody else in the family is just going to deny it anyway. Disney got it right with the movie Encanto. This is a family rooted in trauma. We don't talk about Bruno. We work and we fight and we sulk and we take, but we don't talk, trust, feel, or remember. Now, when nations are rooted in trauma, the same code applies. We get racial hierarchies, violence and the threat of violence as the only imaginable means of security. We get soul-crushing patriarchies and the kind of shallow nationalism that requires us to forget our own history. And this manifests as a social culture that idealizes individualism, selfishness, consumerism, neglect of community and the commons, and this strange obsession with bootstraps. So what's this trauma I'm talking about? Well, imagine what it was like to live in Europe during the Middle Ages. Brutal, ongoing oppression from people who look just like you, with routine torture, wars, famines, plagues, cruel punishments that would be trauma-inducing for us today to even imagine. Think about the toll that the pandemic took on our mental health as a country, and then multiply that by constant war, famine, and torture, and make it last for 1,000 years, 50 generations. By the time the Renaissance came around, my ancestors were severely damaged, and they didn't even know it. They called it Western civilization. Did you know that until about 1800, a common form of summertime entertainment in Europe and its colonies was cat burnings? Entire villages would turn out. They'd fill a sack with cats and then burn them alive over a bonfire for the sheer hilarity of it. If that's not mental illness, we were damaged, traumatized, mentally ill, and we've never really addressed it. At this point, you've probably seen or heard this word, and it might be related to how medieval trauma could affect me today. So I want to tell a little bit about it. Epigenetics is a new pioneering branch of molecular genetics. It's really only been around since the 1990s. So in school, you probably learned about how genes are encoded by DNA and how those gene blueprints determine all of your physical features and some mental and emotional ones too. Well, that's true, but it's not the whole story. Our genes come with packaging. And for decades, scientists thought that that packaging was inert and that it had no role in our development. But it turns out it plays a fairly active role in regulating gene expression. So genes in the DNA get turned on or turned off or are more or less active based on that packaging. And the packaging can be inherited. That's called epigenetic inheritance, because your genes, the DNA itself, isn't changed, but its activity can be changed in a way that's passed on. What does that have to do with trauma? Well, the seminal experiment on this was just done in 2013, very recent. The experimenters exposed mice to acetophenone, which smells like cherry blossoms, just for a few seconds during which they gave them a harmless but painful shock to their feet. And they did this 5 times. The next day, 5 more times, a whiff of the smell and then shocks to the feet. And then again on a 3rd day. But that's it. After that, they let the mice live out their lives, including mating and having babies. When the baby mice were grown, they exposed them to that same smell of cherry blossoms, and the baby mice immediately became anxious. Their heart rate and blood pressure rose, and their behavior was that of panic. A whole generation later, the grandchild mice reacted the same way to the smell of cherry blossoms. So they kind of scratched their heads and they ran the experiment again. But this time they isolated the babies from the parents at birth. Same thing. They used in vitro fertilization and surrogate mothers. Same thing. And these were just harmless shocks over 3 days. This is so surprising and potentially so relevant to who we are that this field of trauma and epigenetics has just exploded. So today there are thousands of studies, really just in the last few years, on epigenetically inherited effects of trauma. It's not simple or clear cut. There are lots of factors, especially in humans, and not all traumas and not all stimuli show up as dramatically as it did with the mice. And of course, we can't really do experiments on humans that involve trauma. But the concept has electrified the relevant sciences. So if it pans out, it suggests that some of our gut reactions, my gut reactions, including ones I don't really like about myself, may have been programmed before I was even born. So I predict that you will see this phrase again. It's entering the popular vocabulary as we speak. And the connection that Resma Menakem makes in his book is that our modern global culture, and specifically Euro-American culture, may be rooted in the trauma of medieval Europe. And that trauma informed and shaped my Euro-American heritage. And it allowed my ancestors to brutalize and exploit indigenous people everywhere they went, initiating a self-repeating cycle of intergenerational trauma and dysfunction that continues today. Trauma and dysfunction are transmitted directly through intergenerational abuse and exploitation, and also culturally, and probably epigenetically. So it's deeply embedded in our bodies, in our minds, our emotional responses, our language, and our religious traditions. It explains a lot, doesn't it? So what do we do now? Well, knowing that all of us are affected by this what I call post-medieval stress disorder, how do we honor the grandchildren and release them from the cycle? Well, I think we have to carefully examine and, yes, often defy our own cultural heritage. So, raise your hand if the extreme consumerism around Christmas bothers you. And then keep your hand up if you're still participating in it. I can't see you. Terry, raise your hand on the Zoom. Yeah, when I do this with other audience, everyone pretty much raises their hands. So I think we've got to pay attention to those nagging feelings and follow them to a new way of being American, a new way of celebrating winter holidays. And in this culture, that's an act of defiance. It's also an act of love for the grandchildren. I think we have to break the rules we inherited from our dysfunctional families and cultures. We have to talk about uncomfortable subjects. We have to trust our neighbors and people that we reflexively regard as the other. I think we have to feel our feelings and honor them, find out what they're trying to tell us. And we have to remember the foolish and evil stuff in our heritage, along with the glorious triumphs. There are glorious triumphs, and their celebration will be so much more meaningful if we remember, honestly and authentically, the missteps and errors and awfulnesses that taught us to reach for them. Remembering it all requires a kind of defiance that's rooted in love for the grandchildren. I think we have to love ourselves when our culture keeps telling us that our value is measured by our work and our possessions and what our bodies look like. Talk about an act of defiance. There's a local artist living in our city, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, named Julia Mallory, and she's the founder of Black Mermaids. It's a website. She's amazing, and I strongly recommend that you look into her work and support it. But For Juneteenth a few years ago, she handed out a sheet of affirmations she wrote that address this directly. Make sure you get a copy of them. I'll put the link in the chat, and I understand that there will be printed copies in church next week when you're back in person. But her affirmations are, I missed a slide. She says, I honor my ancestors and myself by resisting relentless productivity. Talk about defiant, right? Any other workaholics here this morning? That's me. If my only value is in what I accomplish, then accomplishment becomes all that matters. But family matters. Relationships matter. Inspiration, vulnerability, play, and rest, they matter. I honor my ancestors and myself by listening to my body when it tells me it needs rest. Rest is defiant in a culture where rest equals lazy, right? It's just not true. Brene Brown says, it takes courage to say yes to rest and play in a culture where exhaustion is seen as a status symbol. She's right. Courage and a bit of defiance. Speaking of play, I honor my ancestors and myself by making space for joy in my life. Do we even know what joy is? I'm not talking about happiness here. Joy, this kind of joy. When's the last time you felt joy? Actually making space for it kind of goes against the grain. It's love and it's defiant. I honor my ancestors and myself by making space for pleasure in my life. Well, we do this in our culture, but it's often a shallow kind of pleasure, and we often feel a little guilty afterwards, right? I honor my ancestors and myself by realizing that others' limited imagination should have no impact on my life. Raise your hand if you have told a young artist or musician that they should probably have a backup plan. I have. Why do I think my cynicism should have any bearing at all on their art career? It's their life. They'll figure it out. I honor my ancestors and myself by recognizing care as a personal, community, and political act. It's so important to our humanity, but you know, the pay kind of sucks. I honor my ancestors and myself by going where the love is, by being where the love is. Well, you're here this morning, so maybe we're making some progress on those two, but I'll bet we could do a better job of expressing that love. I honor my ancestors and myself by acknowledging that I am already enough. That's radical. By tending to the earth and respecting its natural cycles. We got a long way to go on that one. By caring for the youngest and oldest amongst us. You know, our relentless productivity makes it easier to pay someone else poorly to do that caring. I honor my ancestors and myself by acknowledging that grief work is also freedom work. We don't talk about death in our culture. Birth, we go on and on about birth weight and the breathing and the 3 stages and the gender reveal and the tiny little fingers. Let's talk about death and grieve in community, vulnerably, for as long as it takes. I honor my ancestors and myself by understanding what my work is and doing it. Now, I don't think Julia is talking about the work we trade for money. She's talking about this inner work of cultural growth and healing and the outer work of bending the arc toward justice. What is my work? Am I doing it? I honor my ancestors and myself by remembering the past, taking up space in the present, and building the future. Now, Julia Mallory is Black, and so these affirmations were not written for people like me, meaning old cisgender white men. Old cis white guys always take up cultural space. I'm doing it right now this morning, right? And everyone else is acculturated to expect us to. So I grayed out that middle part on this last affirmation because if you're an old cis white guy, you should just cross that part out. You're probably good on that one. If you're not old, cisgender, white, or male, then you deserve to take and occupy your share of cultural space for the grandchildren, defiantly. Fellow old cis white guys here at Fun, will you support and encourage others in taking up cultural space here in Nashville? I hope so. I encourage you to. Julia's affirmations are all about defiant self-care and community awareness, which is precisely what's needed to soothe and resolve decontextualized trauma. And I'm a rank beginner in this, but there are exercises we can do too. I got to say, I'm a rank beginner in this. Maybe I did already say that. I'm a little confused about where I'm at. Resma's book has a lot of exercises that are designed to free our bodies from unresolved trauma. So I want to encourage you to consider doing that work as a community, as a church community. Other things that may help include yoga, meditation, 12-step programs, Sufi and folk dancing, possibly massage and other kinds of deep body work. Now, Julia is not a UU. I see what's going on. Hold on 1 minute. Technical difficulties. There we go. Julia is not a UU, but her affirmations are all about love. And if you consider them in light of the UUA's new Article 2, you might notice that love is surrounded by the natural implications of honoring our ancestors and loving ourselves and one another. Justice, generosity, pluralism, transformation, equity, interdependence. And it's precisely because love is not at the center of American cultural values that makes Unitarian Universalism such a needed voice, however we might symbolize that love. Now, I only have glimmers of what my ancestors went through, but I am aware that almost every immigrant to this continent came here as a refugee from some trauma, from religious persecution, famine, extreme poverty, war, genocide, or enslavement. And Native Americans are refugees from all of those traumas, but inflicted on them in their own land. So this trauma is in all of us. The most recent science we have says that our ancestors' trauma probably lives on in our bodies as well as our minds, our culture, and our spirits. This is part of our heritage. Now, for those who have been holding your breath this entire time, trying to figure out what is going on in this picture, I'll tell you, sort of. One of these kids is a genetic descendant of my mom, and the other is the child of the same-sex marriage of my mom's grandchild. And no, there is no way to tell from the photo which is which. And the point is that to my mom, it makes no difference whatsoever. They are her grandchildren, full stop. And I got to point out that in spite of those adorable bow ties, you don't know these kids' genders either. No one does. We won't know for sure until they tell us. As it turns out, there is some small hint of a possibility that there might be grandchildren for Anne and me, but I'm not going to hold my breath. There are millions of grandchildren out there for me to care for and nurture. But to do that in good conscience, I have to strive not to pass on the unresolved trauma that comes with my European American heritage. And to do that, I have to defy some aspects of that heritage with love, for love. I have work to do. We have work to do. Let's get started. May it be so.